Watch this vidcast, or I'll gouge your eyes out.
Welcome back, Horror Hounds, to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
I'm Mike Ghostman Pickle.
And I am James Rivera. We have a lot to talk about today, so let's get started.
Horror Show news.
Chris Rock's Saw will star Samuel L. Jackson as Chris Rock's father.
Sarah Paulson and Evan Peters will not star in the 1984 season of American Horror Story.
And Netflix will end Stranger Things after season 4.
Rumors are buzzing that 2 Halloween sequels will be released back-to-back in 2020.
Marilyn Manson to star in the new adaptation of Stephen King's The Stand.
The Soska sisters kicked off Twitter for showing images of their new film, Rabid.
Midsommar originally got an NC-17 rating, and an extended cut is coming to Blu-ray.
Alexandra Aja's Crawl hits theaters.
So starting off with Chris Rock's Saw. That's got the horror community buzzing. It's buzzing even more now that Samuel L. Jackson is going to play Chris Rock's father. And according to CNN, Rock plays a police detective who sets out to investigate some gnarly crimes. Max Minghella plays William Schenk, Rock's partner, and Marisol Nichols plays Captain Angie Garza, Rock's boss. The latest Saw will be directed by Darren Lynn Bousman, who directed 3 of the 7 films in the franchise, and it's scheduled to release on October 23rd, 2020.
This gets more interesting the more I hear about it. Samuel L. Jackson is not a conventional choice for a movie like this.
Yeah,
and to be honest, Chris Rock is not even a conventional choice to helm something like this.
Yeah.
Well, I know he's not directing it. I understand that this is his creative brainchild, so I know he's in charge of as a producer and a creator of the storyline. I'm sure he's going to have heavy involvement and a lot of say in who gets cast and who's going to be in it.
And I normally wouldn't be excited about another Saw movie at all. I still haven't even seen Jigsaw. But just the fact that Chris Rock is involved, I was ready to check it out.
And he says he has a fresh new idea.
He's really intelligent and really creative in his stand-up, and his movie Top 5 was just excellent. I thought it was really underrated, and it didn't get enough attention. So I'm really excited to see what he does with horror.
Sarah Paulson and Evan Peters not going to be in the 1984 season of American Horror Story.
What's their reasoning behind this, James?
Sarah Paulson says, accordingly, Sarah Paulson is overly busy. She's going to be working with Ryan Murphy, creator of American Horror Story, on a new Netflix series called Ratchet, a show based on the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where I presume she'll be playing Nurse Ratchet.
Yeah.
Seems like a good choice.
Nice.
She's also currently filming the upcoming FX series about the ratifications of the Equal Rights Amendment called Mrs. America. She's also in upcoming movies The Run and The Goldfinch, as well as lending her voice to the animated film Abominable. From what I hear, she might actually have an appearance in the season. It would be a small part. It wouldn't be a full-on starring role, but she might pop up for a few episodes or something like that.
That'll be good.
Kind of what Emma Roberts usually does, where she only pops up most of the time for a few episodes. This time, it's the other way around. She'll be stepping up and she'll be one of the leads.
Yeah, and I was interested in seeing this response, especially from Evan Peters, because he's the one who I would think would be one of the stars of a season like this. But as you'll read,
according to GQ, an interview he gave with GQ magazine, Evan Peters said, "It's been all a massive stretch for me and really difficult to do. It's hurting my soul and Evan as a person. There's this massive amount of rage that's been called upon for me, and the emotional stuff that's been called on me for Pose has been heartbreaking, and I'm sick. I don't feel good."
And he seems to be the type of actor who dedicates to these roles, and he's feeling what you're seeing him feel on screen. He has to conjure those emotions in real life. It's real to him in that moment, and that's why it's so hard on him.
I was initially a little bit upset when I heard that Evan Peters wasn't going to be part of it, because I think he'd be perfect for a slasher season of a story like this. Having heard his explanation, I can't fault him at all. I understand, as on a human level, on a personal level, it's important for you to take care of your health and make sure that your mental state is good. And if he needs to clear his head a little bit before getting back into a steady rotation of acting, I feel that he should do it.
And if he were to be in a season like this, you know that he would be given a hard, challenging role, you know.
Probably something dark, possibly a killer or one of the killers. Who knows where the season's going to go. So while I'm a little bit disappointed, I'm still looking forward to the season, because I did enjoy the last season quite a bit, and I've enjoyed American Horror Story for the most part, or even if it falters here and there, for the most part, I've really enjoyed the show.
Well, even though I didn't like the Freak Show season,
It had elements.
I'm really hoping they'll bring Dandy into the slasher season.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if they did, because it has good elements. Dandy would be a good slasher killer, but then again, maybe they'll come up with something a little bit more original than falling back on established characters from previous seasons. But
yeah, but if they do include him, it'll be along with many other aspects, because they say it's going to be a slasher season, but you know they're going to go in all kinds of directions. It's going to be multiple genres mixed in with the slasher genre.
Like every American Horror Story, it's almost every horror genre thrown into a blender.
Yeah, like you think Coven is going to be all about witches, and it's about zombies and vampires and demons, and so I'm very interested to see what kind of elements they'll bring into the slasher subgenre. So as we might have guessed, Netflix is going to end season Stranger Things after season 4, and it was originally supposed to be 5 seasons. That's originally what they planned on, but the Duffer Brothers have to keep upping the stakes higher, and as you can see, since you've been watching season 3, that they up the ante with effects and with story and everything,
and with the Russians, and by expanding the scope of the story.
Yeah, and it's not set in stone that's going to end at season 4. It will depend on what the Duffer Brothers come up with for that season. And according to the Duffer Brothers, they're quoted as saying, "We don't want to write ourselves in a corner, so we try to have these early discussions with the writers just to make sure that we're setting ourselves up to go in the right direction."
I'm okay with it. I mean, it seems like at first I thought it was, Netflix being Netflix, how they like to cancel everything early so they don't have to keep paying their actors and their showrunners more. But if it's a creative decision, I guess that makes sense. It must be hard from a storytelling point to keep upping the stakes more and more and more without making it unbelievable, while still making it believable.
Yeah.
Within the context of the universe that they set up.
Well,
so I'm all for whatever decision they make, if it goes up to 4 or 5. So long as the Duffer Brothers are comfortable with what they're doing and they feel that they can close it off strong. I think that's what matters.
Well, at the end of every season I watch, I end up saying, where are they going to go from here? And they keep upping the stakes every time.
I'm sure they ask themselves that after the end of every season.
Because this one had more of everything. More action, more horror, more story, more everything.
A lot of shocking moments, too.
Yeah, and pretty fast-paced through the whole thing, but it was also patient with the character development moments and the sweet coming-of-age moments and stuff like that. So it's just really well-rounded season, and they took it to heights that were just as exciting as any movie that you'll see. So you're 3 episodes in?
3 episodes in, so hopefully I will have it finished by next week so I could give my thoughts on what, but I'm enjoying it so far. All the elements are in place. It seems the stakes are going higher. I'm enjoying Maya Hawke's character, Robin.
Yes.
Daughter
awesome.
of Uma Thurman and of Ethan Hawke, and every time I see her, I could see Uma Thurman and Ethan Hawke in her face when I look at her.
And she was given quite a bit to do for being a new character. She seems to have the Uma Thurman type of swagger, where it's almost like an airy, like a beautiful, like hippie type of vibe.
Well, I just hope that they finish it off strong, whether it's 4 or 5 seasons, so long as it creatively feels right.
Yeah, from what they've shown us so far, I think Duffer Brothers are the type of directors you can trust.
And to trust to end it on the right note.
Yeah, especially since you know that they plan on ending it, so you know that they're not going to stretch it to season 5 unless they know that they have the right idea
story for it.
Yeah.
Speaking of stretching things out, the rumors are floating that 2 Halloween sequels are going to be released back-to-back in 2020.
Oh, goodness.
David Gordon Green, director of the Halloween reboot from last year, would be returning in some capacity, most likely as a director, as well as star Jamie Lee Curtis. The rumor is, and this is not confirmed, that it's 2 films shot back-to-back with the possibility of being released a month apart. Like the Stranger Things Season 4 ending possibility, nothing is set in stone. It just depends on how it goes at this point. But I'm pretty interested. For one, I'm not sure if we needed to continue the story because there's so many continuations of it. But if they're going to shoot 2 films back-to-back and they have it in their head, and with the possibility of releasing it in the same month, they must have something really special up their sleeve, or they must have something really planned out, because those are not the type of creative decisions you just arrive at without some forethought or without an idea of what the story might be.
Yeah.
So, if anything, the fact that they're doing this experiment, possibly releasing it the same month, possibly not, we don't know yet, they could be released a year apart, indicates a very strong direction or a sense of where they're going.
Well, first of all, I know that since Jamie Lee Curtis is involved, I'm pretty sure that David Gordon Green
It's going to return.
will return to direct, because she said that she wouldn't do another one unless he was going to direct it. So if she puts that much faith in him, and then John Carpenter puts that much faith in him, and from what I hear, John Carpenter would definitely be involved in this new one.
I hope so. I hope he continues to do the score.
First of all, it's not set in stone, and second of all, if it does turn out to be 2 back-to-back Halloweens in the same month, filmed back-to-back, it'd be almost an unprecedented type of thing. And you know that they have the idea to match that type of bold move. Even though it seems like an outrageous type of idea, I trust these filmmakers.
It's so outrageous that I don't think they would attempt to pull it off unless they really had something solid in mind for this.
Really, the only problem I had with the last Halloween is just a lot of fan service. But I loved it that it was fan service. But upon repeat viewings, it kind of gets in the way that it's fan service. So
probably a lot less of that this time.
Yeah, because of that, I think that, especially if it's going to be 2 back-to-back things, I think the fan service is out the door, and they're just going to make a really solid Halloween. The next story is Marilyn Manson is going to star in the new adaptation of Stephen King's The Stand. It's going to be a 10-episode series on CBS All Access. There's no details about who Marilyn Manson will play, but he did cover The Doors' The End with country singer Shooter Jennings. All he said was in an interview about cover is that he was also going to act in it. The writer is Josh Boone, the writer and director of the series, and he's from Fault in Our Stars, which is like a teen drama.
With Ansel Elgort?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's really solid and well written, so I'm sure this is going to be good. Writer Josh Boone said, I thought this was interesting. He's obviously going to do this right because this statement shows how much this story means to him. So he says, I read The Stand under my bed when I was 12, and my Baptist parents burned it in our fireplace upon discovery. Incensed, I stole my dad's FedEx account number and mailed Stephen King a letter professing my love for his work. The ban on King's books was lifted when I came home to find a box had arrived from Maine, and inside were several books, each inscribed with a beautiful note from God himself.
So because Stephen King stepped in, his parents let him keep him after all?
I imagine that would kind of change their mind about it.
Yeah.
This famous author, how many authors are more famous than Stephen King, especially in horror?
Probably none, especially in anything. He's the most successful author of the 20th century, period.
And for him to not only get notes from this man, to get those notes in his books.
It also speaks to how much Stephen King loves his fans and how
Yes.
he appreciates the horror fandom. He doesn't turn his nose up at it.
He cares how much his influence as a writer affects the cinematic universe, you know.
So the Soska sisters were kicked off Twitter for showing images of their new film Rabid, their remake of the David Cronenberg.
I love this story.
Jen Soska on her Facebook page said, "It has been a big disappointment and so weird for Twitter to shut us down for images that were cool enough to be on the covers of 2 huge publications, Fangoria and Rue Morgue. That image has been reposted so many times. Why punish the filmmakers who are just announcing their film's world premiere?" This is the synopsis. What happens when you realize that to achieve your dreams you have to live a nightmare? Rose is a quiet, demure, unassuming woman in her looks and actions. Her dream is to become a famous designer in the fashion world, but a terrible accident leaves Rose scarred beyond recognition. She seeks out a radical, untested stem cell treatment. The treatment is nothing short of a miracle, and Wallflower Rose turns into the belle of the ball. It all seems all too good to be true. She is now everything she wanted to be, but everything in life comes at a price, and this newfound perfect life is no exception. I think it's really lame of Twitter to be kicking them off for images from a film, because I've seen a lot more offensive and more ridiculous and outrageous things pass muster on that site.
Yeah.
And they're really inconsistent with their rules and who could say what, and so it just sounds like a lot of bullshit to me, especially something that these are, studio approved images. They've been on the cover of magazines already. There's no need to be censoring or hiding from people what these are, especially since most of the people who are going to be following the Soska sisters are going to be Soska sisters are going to be horror fans.
Yeah.
So who do they think they're protecting by doing this?
I think it's somewhat of a backlash over so many people posting so many really horrific real photos and stuff like that. So they're trying
go
to,
after that.
Yeah, and they're trying to combat against that. But
I don't buy that. I think that's
but-
a lame ass excuse.
this image that they kicked them off Twitter for, it's not even gore. It's like the girl's mouth was kind of fucked up in this accident. So it's kind of sewed back together, and there's wires holding her jaw shut.
I've seen the image. I don't think it's really that. I've seen much more shocking things on Twitter than that.
Yeah, so it's kind of shocking, but it's obviously prosthetics. I mean, and really good prosthetics. But why would you ban something like that? I think they have it out for horror because a lot of horror fans ride that line between, grotesque, almost pornographic. That's a lot of things they're combating too. A lot of the nudity and the sexual stuff that goes with horror images. But this had none of that. And speaking of, this is kind of a censorship type of story too, where Midsommar originally got an NC-17, and that means the extended cut is coming to Blu-ray when it comes out. So that is 30 minutes longer. Ari Aster says, yes, we had an NC-17 for 6 weeks. Lots of back and forth with the MPAA, because they were not a fan of the full frontal nudity of the Christian character Jack Rayner.
And that's funny because if it were a female being fully frontal nude for that long, they wouldn't have any issue with it at all. I guarantee you, I've seen a lot of R-rated horror movies that shown more female full frontal nudity than that. So to say that any longer would have got it in NC-17 is bullshit and fucking hypocritical. But as it is, I fucking despise the MPAA. There's a bunch of people who know nothing about films or art or movies in general. It's a bunch of soccer moms.
Yeah, they have convoluted rules. The convoluted rules and the hypocrisy in their decisions that they make, and some of their decisions are financially motivated.
They're
Like
very
if someone
financially motivated.
kicks them down some money, they'll ease off their rating. It's bullshit.
You ever notice it's not a coincidence that independent and smaller budgeted films have a harder time securing an R ratings than big budget films that are more graphic with more violence, but that's all they care about is if money, and that's what they care about. It's just all about money. It's all about money with these people, and it's just a bunch of soccer moms who think they can determine what the rest of America sees just because they don't think it's appropriate for little Johnny or whatnot. Which I don't give a fuck. You don't get to tell me what I get to watch and what I don't watch. Your rules are stupid.
Yeah, and if they can be swayed one way or another because of financial reasons, then that makes their opinion worthless.
Yeah,
it makes them worthless.
The moral hypocrisy behind them is so galling and so upfront that it's kind of outrageous that they have the balls to still try to censor a lot of independent films, knowing goddamn well how much money they took from Harvey Weinstein to let him keep whatever he wanted in his films. So it's just a sack of shit.
And it's insulting to filmmakers. And
it's insulting to filmmakers, it's insulting to audiences, it's insulting to on so many levels, and they think that they're being so morally superior.
Yeah, and they use their power to almost ruin filmmakers sometimes. Like Adam Green has had so many problems with the MPAA. It's made him stressed out where he doesn't even want to release a movie anymore.
Yeah.
In theaters like that, he wants to just release them unrated, which they give him a hard time about that too, because they try to control everything that goes into the theaters. It's ridiculous.
So they bitch and whine and they piss and moan about their ratings, but if you don't go through them, then they get mad. I'm like, fucking you. What do you think you are? You think you can control what get put out into the public? Like, I fucking hate the MPAA for that reason. That they actually pull shit. It'd be one thing if they think they can just slap their ratings on, but then to tell people what they can and cannot do just because it didn't go through them. Who are they? What makes them an authority? They don't know anything about film or art or anything like that.
Yeah, they're a ridiculous organization.
On another hand, I am excited to see a 30-minute extra cut of Somar. I know a lot of people are not going to because I know that this was really divisive, but I'm all in so long as it's more depravity, more violence.
They mentioned
I'm just kidding. I would see anything extra 30 minutes, even if that's not what it is.
They mentioned the MPAA having problem with the full frontal nudity of Christian, but there's a lot of full frontal nudity in there. Does that mean that there's even more in the 30-minute cut?
Probably.
'Cause that thing was flopping around everywhere, dude.
From what I heard in an interview with Jack Rayner, he actually wanted to push the full frontal nudity a little bit more. Because he says it would be a balance for I don't have the exact quote, but he said something along the lines of how the horror genre is infamous for years exploiting women and their bodies and putting their characters in humiliating or uncomfortable situations.
Yeah.
So he was all for putting his character through that.
Literally and figuratively stripped bare.
I have no idea what else is in this. Maybe there's more. It could be just more storytelling aspects of it. I doubt all 30 minutes are things that made it, that almost got it NC-17. I'm pretty sure of it is just a lot of creative things put back in. It can't all be salacious extra footage.
Yeah, well, sometimes the MPA will suggest like these ridiculous cuts, like with Natural Born Killers. When Oliver Stone asked him, okay, what do you want me to cut to make this an R, and I'll cut it. No, we can't tell you. It's too much all throughout. So he had to go through and shave little pieces off until they would accept it.
Alexander Aja's Crawl hits theaters.
And this is getting a lot of buzz. I mean, the only problem I have with what I've seen so far is just that they showed so much in the
Yeah,
trailer.
I feel like I already know the plot of the movie.
But I'm still very excited to see it. I love that director, and it just seems like a really solid monster movie.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
All right, so let's get with what we've watched lately. You watched Stranger Things, and I watched my horror Tubi roulette assignment, Pumpkinhead from 1988.
How was it upon a rewatch?
I absolutely loved it. It really held up, and I liked it probably even better than I did when I was a kid. Because when I was younger, I was like 16, 17 when I watched it. And I watched it just because it was a cool monster movie. And then when I watched it this time, it was so much better than just another monster movie. It's a really good story. Stan Winston, the special effects wizard, that was his directorial debut.
Did he do any other movies besides that, or was it just...
As far as I know, yeah, that's his only movie.
He had quite a career, though, because he worked with Tim Burton on several films, with James Cameron on The Terminators,
Yeah.
with Steven Spielberg on the Jurassic Park. He helped with the makeup effects on The Thing for John Carpenter. Arguably the greatest special effects wizard in the history of the medium.
And that's why
a number of accomplishments.
That's why the production company approached him, because they wanted to have him create the monster. And he said no, he loved the script, and he saw that as his chance to direct, to prove himself as a director for the first time, and he knocked it out of the park. And what's funny is that he didn't even end up designing any of the monster. He kind of left it up to the special effects team. So he hired a good, solid special effects team and tasked them with creating the monster, and he was supposed to supervise. But then he got so busy with the directing that he ended up letting them do it themselves. And which is amazing, because watching it you think, oh, that's great work by Stan Winston, and then you find out that he didn't even, he was so preoccupied with directing duties that he didn't end up designing it. The story is based on a poem by Ed Justin, and it stars Lance Henriksen and just this group of really unlikable college kids. Certain aspects of it are familiar monster movie tropes. A group of college kids move into a cabin and a monster's after them. But this one gets the extra twist of Lance Henriksen playing the father of a boy who is accidentally killed by those college kids. They hit him with a motorcycle. So he conjures this Pumpkinhead demon. He goes to this witch's house in the middle of the woods and conjures this demon to take revenge on the college kids, and boy does he.
One of the things that this is a movie that I saw in 1997. It was probably the last time I saw it when I was young. And I only saw it one time, but I remember it very well for having seen it one time. And to me, that says something about the film, that if I could remember it from childhood after one viewing, that I could still recall a lot of it. Like I said, I never even looked up the plot, but I did remember the fact that that a young boy was killed on accident by these group of teens, and I remember the father being really angry and going to the witch doctor to get the revenge. And I also remember his guilt. That's something that stuck out in my brain, because he starts to see the murders at some point, right? Am I correct? He starts to witness what Pumpkinhead is doing.
Yeah, that's what adds an extra layer to the story and really makes it effective, because when Pumpkinhead goes after someone, then you see Lance Henriksen's eyes kind of cloud over, and he sees that person being killed, so he hits the ground. It seems like he feels it and sees it at the same time. So after seeing a couple of those deaths, he says, I can't do this, what have I done? And one of the best parts in the movie, and it's actually the scene that made Lance Henriksen most want to do it, the movie, is when he's having like a dream, he's having a nightmare, and his dead son just rises up and looks at him. What did you do, Daddy? It was just so effective, and that's one of the main reasons why he took the movie. One thing I realized watching it as a filmmaker, when I first started watching it, I realized, okay, this isn't just a monster movie, it's a serious movie. And once you see that a movie takes itself seriously, you automatically start to scrutinize it more, because it raises the bar for itself early. And then it needs to maintain that bar throughout the rest of the film, and then it needs to raise it further by the end.
And climaxes.
And that's exactly what it did. Since I did scrutinize it a little bit more, since I seen how serious it was and I seen how well made it was, I did notice a couple silly parts. Like, for instance, this might be a spoiler for some of you who haven't seen it. So it gets toward the end, and Lance Henriksen gears up and he's going to go fight Pumpkinhead. So he's walking, they face each other. He goes walking toward Pumpkinhead. Oops, I run into a pitchfork, and a pitchfork sticks him in the shoulder. So that's when he finds out, like, when he gets hurt, then Pumpkinhead gets hurt. So it's a little bit of a convoluted way to reveal Pumpkinhead's weakness, but like I said, I was really scrutinizing it at that point, and that's really a minor complaint considering what a great movie was surrounded by that silly part.
What sticks out to me about that movie, having only seen it once, is the father's guilt, because I remember a scene where he goes to the witch doctor who had summoned Pumpkinhead for him and tries to beg her to stop it and everything, and she kind of rubs his face in it, that like, this is what you wanted, you got what you wanted, kind of rubs his face and shit, where there's like a moral guilt that goes through the entire film that is not typically associated with monster movies. Most of the time, it's just trying to get you, the audience excited. It's a monster movie, something's come after you. This one is weighed down by a heavy dose of guilt. Yeah. And from what I remember, it made a lot of the killings and the gore a little bit more effective than it was just about Pumpkinhead going out and just thrashing a bunch of teenagers for no reason. Yeah, because
he doesn't just feel guilty. It's the fact that you can tell he didn't realize that he was going to be seeing and feeling these deaths that were caused by him, And
it's one thing to wish something bad upon somebody else. It's another to, come close to the reality of what these awful things are and the human suffering that comes behind it. So it's kind of a moral reckoning for the father in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, and the person who hit the kid was really the only bad person. He was just an over-the-top, complete asshole, and it makes you hate him. And then everyone else around where it seemed like good people, but they were just, you didn't have any respect for them because they were so weak that they let this guy run over them and do this horrible thing, and they were letting him get away with it. Probably my favorite scene of the movie is when the kids are in the cabin and they see Pumpkinhead kind of go by the window. So they're kind of huddled in the corner, scared, and they're watching to see where he's at. And all of a sudden, Pumpkinhead takes one of their friends by the head, and he puts her face up against the window, and he starts rubbing her face all over the window, and she's got like drool and blood on her face. So he rubs her face all against the window and then pushes it through the plain glass. And then the moment the girl's head goes through the window, her friend faints. I thought that was such an effective scene.
It's probably effective because that's a realistic reaction. If you were to see a monster beyond your wildest dreams doing something like that, you probably would pass out. It's probably something too much for you to even. It's too much for you to even for a person to even process.
Yeah, and if you're thinking horror movie and that a monster is coming after people like this, you think that go-to thing would be if you show this image that the girl inside would scream bloody murder. Mm-hmm. But instead he went the realistic route and just had her just pass out. I loved it.
So we actually have a very big topic for us.
It's one of those topics we just came up with accidentally because we were genuinely curious about this.
We wanted to find out what the biggest theatrical horror films of all time were.
We started on a one master list from this one website, and then as we started analyzing it, we seen some indiscrepancies there, and we found another list that had some different films on it, and the numbers were a little different. So we had to do our own research. So as far as we know, this is the most comprehensive list of the biggest theatrical horror releases of all time.
Just to let you know, this is adjusted for inflation, and this is only domestic, meaning this is only in the United States. The list of highest grossing films of all time is always going to be recent due to the reality of inflation.
Yeah.
So all of the biggest films are always going to be from the past 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, while movies from 30 years ago, 40 years ago that might have been actually bigger, fall further and further down on the list. So we wanted to do it based on the actual popularity and asses and seats. So we did this adjusted for inflation. We're going to give you what the actual most popular theatrical horror films of all time were. We're also not going into the worldwide grosses, only because for a lot of these older films, the grosses worldwide are not available. This type of information was not recorded, was not put on record. So we apologize to any of our listeners who feel that we're leaving out different countries or anything, or any of our listeners outside the US. This is for the sake of trying to make this as cohesive as possible with what limited information that we have. These are the top 31 biggest theatrical horror releases of all time.
Horror show exclusive.
And the first one is one of our favorites of all time, The Shining,
Coming
from
in at
1980.
Number 31.
Yeah, and the adjusted for inflation, it would have made $147.2 million.
It actually made $44,781,695.
And that was considered, it wasn't a flop, but it didn't do as well as they thought, right?
No, it didn't do as well as they thought. In the day, they thought it was going to be a bigger film. But relatively speaking, for a haunted house horror movie or something like that, that's actually a pretty impressive gross, because if it came out today, it would make almost $150 million.
Yeah.
It's actually not bad. I just feel like even though this is on 31, which means that it's pretty big, it made a big impact when it went to theaters. Most of The Shining's impact came out after the fact of people watched it at home, people watched it on TV, people go to theatrical revivals, and it started becoming a bigger thing in pop culture throughout the years, more being rediscovered by certain audiences. So it was solidly big when it came out, but nothing to indicate the massive pop culture phenomenon that it has grown into.
And living in LA, there's several screenings of it on the big screen throughout the year.
I've seen The Shining 5 times in a theatrical setting, and every time it's always blown me away, or it's always impressed me.
That's when it's a timeless classic in every way.
Good way to kick off the list.
Yeah. And we had to make it 31 because we had to include The Shining in this list because it came so close to the 31. And then as we developed the list, it kind of got bumped out. We're like, oh, hell no, we got to mention that one.
So now to the top 30.
Starting out with our top 30 is not a great film, Scream 3 from 2000. It made $148.7 million.
Adjusted for inflation, that's how much it would have made today.
Yeah.
And, well, I don't really think this is even close to being amongst the best horror films of all time. I could understand why it was a big hit in its day. It's coming hot off the success of Scream 1 and Scream 2, which were only a couple years earlier, and those were big sleeper hits, big smashes.
Yeah.
So it only makes sense that there would have been some kind of anticipation for the third one, even if it didn't live up to the hype.
Yeah, so it was mostly that big because of name recognition. It didn't have staying power to be as successful as the other two. Number 29 is The Others, starring Nicole Kidman from 2001. Adjusted for inflation, it would have made $153.5 million, and the actual box office was $96,522,687.
I remember this being parodied a lot when it came out. It was pretty popular, the whole "I am your daughter" scene, where a lot of people talked about it. It was a twist. It was kind of almost like, not quite on the same scale, but almost like a Sixth Sense type of film after the Sixth Sense came out. You know, something in that vein. But yeah, I remember it being a pretty big thing at the time.
And it's a pretty solid supernatural thriller.
Yeah, I like it.
Nicole Kidman is really good in it.
Nicole Kidman's always great.
Almost tied with that one, it made about the same adjusted for inflation, was The Grudge from 2004. The box office was $110,359,362.
But adjusted for inflation, it would have made $153.5 million today. On on numbers 31 through 26, we had to do a lot of research consulting Box Office Mojo and going to different websites. So these ones are pretty close to each other. It's hard to know which one, but they are both this is definitely the top 30, but it's hard to know which one is 29, which one is 28, and even 27 gets a little bit because they're so close to each other in terms of their gross.
Yeah, because The Grudge was 2004 and it made 110 million, which was more than the others, but the others was 3 years before that. So adjusted for inflation, they made about the same.
And then next up we have, what's up next on our list? Is
The Haunting from 1999.
Same year as The Sixth Sense and The Blair Witch Project.
Yeah, big year for movies in general. It really launched a newfound success for horror films after that.
154.4 million adjusted for inflation, 91 million at the time. That's impressive only for the fact that a movie to make that much of an impact at the box office, a horror movie in the same year that The Blair Witch Project and The Sixth Sense were tearing it up, shows you that there was demand for it. It wasn't just two films, that people were hungry for horror at the time.
Yeah, and I don't think it was a great film. It was overly CGI. It had some cool moments because it had some really good actors in it, but overall it was just too cartoonish for me.
I think it was just probably coming off of the hunger that people had for good horror at the time.
Yeah.
And it has pretensions to something a lot better than it actually is.
And wasn't this a remake of Haunting of Hill House?
No, The Haunting is actually an old... I don't remember where it's from. It's either from the 40s or 50s, but it's an old horror film, so it is a remake of a classic horror film from the 1940s or 1950s. It's available on the Criterion Collection, the original one. You could get it on Blu-ray. So we should actually make that a point to check out the original, The Haunting.
So the next one is number 26, one of my favorites, The Conjuring from 2013.
How much did it make at the time, and how much would it have made now?
It actually made at the time $137,400,000, and adjusted for inflation, it made $157,060,000.
I'm happy for this one. For one, it displaced Saw as the ultimate horror franchise that everybody was getting excited for. Yeah. And it's a lot more creative than a lot of the franchises that were tearing up horror before it, like the Paranormal Activity films over and over and the Saw movies. I feel like The Conjuring brought commercial horror back to a place where they were more fully rounded films.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. More of like a full-on film, not just... another little Paranormal Activity found footage or another Saw movie where they're just, going through the motions and trying to get out of these traps while being tortured. Like a return to a horror film dominating the box office.
And I love that they were haunted house films that were rated R, but they were rated R because of just how scary they were.
And I think the intensity of it showed. I remember I actually went to go see Conjuring on opening night in a packed audience. And everybody was jumping, screaming, jumping out of their seats. It seemed like everybody had a blast at the theater I went to. It seemed like it went over really well. Yeah. And given the audience reception that it had, it doesn't surprise me that it went on to make so much money with the word of mouth. So we are now entering our top 25 highest grossing horror films of all time.
And actually, it's worth mentioning that both 25 and 24 are very recent films. It's 2018's Halloween made $159,342,000
this past October. That one doesn't surprise me because I feel like this was really anticipated by a lot of people. And it came out at just the right time, right around Halloween as people were craving this.
Yeah.
And it was advertised as a return to form for the Michael Myers franchise. And I saw it a couple times in theaters, and both audiences I saw it with were pretty packed, and they had a pretty receptive response to the film.
Yeah, and with success like that, it's no wonder that they're talking about sequel. So of course it's going to happen, just in what capacity we aren't quite sure yet.
So that one cracked the top 25 last year.
And I think it shows how hungry people are for Michael Myers and how hungry they are for R-rated slashers. And the other one is quite different from Halloween. It came out this year in 2019. Is Jordan Peele's Us.
Yes.
It made a whopping $175 million.
Jordan Peele has such established himself in the zeitgeist, and after Get Out becoming such a big word-of-mouth hit and him winning an Oscar and being on The Twilight Zone and everywhere, I feel like this was bound to be a massive success given his career trajectory.
I'll go ahead and say the next one on the list is Jordan Peele as well, which is Get Out, which you just mentioned, in 2017. So already with his first two movies, he's in number 24 and 23 of the most popular horror films
Theatrical.
ever in the theater.
I couldn't be happier for the man's success. Is for one, it's not only is it impressive for to have horror films make this much money in this day and age, independent horror films that are original stories,
Yes.
original films in any genre have a hard time making much of a dent at the box office these days. And for these two to become such big hits with no franchise tie-in, no pre-established property, no built-in fan bases is really impressive. Where Jordan Peele himself is the brand. And the same way that people go to a Quentin Tarantino movie, of course he stocks his movies with stars and everything, but people go because it's his name.
Yeah.
I feel like Jordan Peele is becoming that filmmaker that anytime he makes something, it's it's going to be unique, and just his name being attached to it is going to be enough to get asses in seats.
Yeah, and it happened so quickly.
Really
Just in
quickly.
a couple years of each other, his first two films is unprecedented.
They're both critically acclaimed. They were both massive box office successes, and I couldn't be happier for somebody like Jordan Peele, who is an immensely talented figure in the industry at the moment.
Yeah. And as popular as Us is, Get Out was just a little bit more popular. So where Us made a little over 175 million, Get Out made 181 million.
And that doesn't surprise me. Us actually opened bigger than Get Out because it was hot off the success and the anticipation.
Yeah.
Get Out didn't have as strong as an opening as Us, but what made it, the reason it made money is because the strong word of mouth gave the movie legs.
Had longevity because of it. And plus that it got nominated for Academy Awards. That gave it a little bit of a
Extra
resurgence.
boost, yeah.
Get Out was a really solid film. And even though I didn't like Us, I didn't connect with it. I respect it because it's a bold movie, a bold move for him in that point in his career. And the fact that it's still connected with so many people, I'm proud of him for it, and still excited to see what he does next.
Not only that, it's a movie that is very unconventional. Like you said, it's bold. There's a lot of strange, surreal images of dreamy things, of people eating rabbits down. Not people eating rabbits, but rabbits going around. Films with that type of imagery and that are that idiosyncratic rarely ever hit the mainstream the way that one does. So that in itself is impressive, that he took such a strange, bold movie and made it popular.
It's really exciting to have a voice like Jordan Peele in horror. Number 22 goes back a little farther to 1992, Bram Stoker's Dracula.
This one surprised me. I didn't realize that Bram Stoker's Dracula, which I love, I really like that movie a lot. I didn't realize it was that big of a thing. But I guess with Winona Ryder, Gary Oldman, and Keanu Reeves, and the Hopkins, a star-studded cast helped to like a big Hollywood production.
And it's a period horror film, like a gothic horror film, which was really popular back in the 30s and 40s, but and 50s even. Wasn't as popular at the time, and thanks to probably Gary Oldman's performance was the main thing that put that
Film
movie
up
over
at
the top. Yeah. And Francis Ford Coppola, of course.
I feel like that was like a passion project that he wanted to get out. And because it was such a passion project for him, he did The Godfather Part 3 just so he could get Dracula made. I think that you see that passion reflected in the quality of the film itself.
The actual box office for Bram Stoker's Dracula was 82,522,000, and adjusted for inflation, that would be 181,749,000.
So relatively around the same popularity as Get Out.
Yeah, so this was huge for the time.
Still impressive numbers, even unadjusted.
Well deserved.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll gouge your eyes out.
Coming in at number 21 is another recent one from 2018, A Quiet Place.
Another recent one?
Yeah, and it made 188,024,000.
188. I think it's very telling that we've, in the top 25, there's already a bunch that are really recent. I think that speaks for how popular horror is currently.
And another recent original.
John Krasinski this time.
Coming in at number 20 is Halloween from 1978. And this is so high on the list, even though it made $47 million in the box office when it came out. And just adjusted for inflation, that makes $183,581,000.
That would be impressive for this day and age because it's a low-budget indie slasher film. And you could see that it's not very high budget, but it didn't really need a big budget.
Yeah, so technically even more popular than the new Halloween.
So for something independent to make that much of a smash that would have made $183 million now,
Yeah.
Only shows how the quality of the movie. I imagine it was just one of those things that was word of mouth as well.
Yeah,
I don't think it
was
didn't open up huge like that.
It was a guy in a mask walking around killing people.
I imagine that the word of mouth probably spread really fast, and I think people knew instantly that a new horror icon was born once they'd seen that film.
So coming in at number 19 is Scream 2 from 1997. At the time, it made $101,363,000.
Unadjusted, that's already impressive.
Yeah, already for a
slasher
sequel. Yeah. And adjusted for inflation, that would make $200,172,000. Wow.
Can you imagine a slasher sequel making over $200 million now in this day and age? Impressive. But the first one was such a big hit, and this one came right off the heels. It was released exactly 1 year to the day that the original Scream was released.
Yeah.
So that was when Scream was tearing up the pop culture sphere. They jumped on it really fast, and probably smartly too, because the quality is really, really good. Yeah. I think the fact that they jumped on it so fast while it was still part of the cultural zeitgeist helped to make the next Scream almost as successful as the first one.
Look at what a massive impact Wes Craven has had on the horror genre. Not only innovations that have inspired other filmmakers, but box office numbers too. Just some of the most successful horror films of all time, a lot of them are his.
It speaks to his quality.
Yeah, well deserving.
Scream 2, one of my favorite slasher sequels.
Even though he did slip a little bit, but we like to forget that. Oh yeah, I thought you were going to hit the groovy button. We're like, no,
that's not groovy.
That's not groovy at all.
More like not.
All right, so coming in at 18, we have a remake, The Ring, 2002 remake of Ringu.
I remember how big that was when it came out. Everybody was parroting the scene of the little girl with the hair in front of her face crawling out of the television set, crawling out of the well, and then crawling out of the television set.
Yeah.
And then everybody going around quoting 7 days.
It was instantly iconic.
It brought in a new wave of horror films. For a while, for that period during the early 2000s, it seems like horror films were dominated by American remakes of classic Japanese horror films.
Yeah.
And that was the thing for that time.
Yeah, and that theme got old pretty quick, didn't it?
Yeah. It was a horror trend that only lasted a couple years and burned out really fast. But the time it was out, I remember it was pretty intense. That's all that people wanted to see in horror movies.
Because on a lot of them, the quality wasn't there. Mm-hmm. And they were made by filmmakers who didn't seem to understand the impact, what made the impact of the originals. So they'd try to do them in a different way, in a more Americanized way. And a lot of them, it just didn't work. It
drained them of what made the original Japanese ones so scary in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
The American sensibilities leached out some of the creepiness. The Ring is actually one of the few that was able to retain, the flavor of some of the flavor of the original. Was able to retain that spookiness.
Yeah, because it wasn't treated as a cash grab.
Exactly, and it wasn't. It was. At the time, it wasn't following a wave. It's what set the trend.
Yeah.
It wasn't following any kind of trend, and it was probably a risky gamble at the time because they didn't know how audiences were going to respond to this. But apparently, they responded very well.
Yeah, in the tone of $129,128,000 it made in the theater. Adjusted for inflation, that's $202,984,000.
Even without being adjusted, that still would have been an impressive number for that movie.
For sure.
So it made over $200 million.
It really put Naomi Campbell on the map, right?
Yeah, I think that's a film that made her a star.
Yeah, and gave us another horror icon, Samara. And number 17 is the great Wes Craven, we just mentioned, in Scream, 1996. It made just $103,046,000 in the box office, but adjusted
at the time.
Yeah, at the time, but adjusted for inflation, that's $206,128,000.
So adjusted for inflation, it only made a few million more than Scream 2.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I can't even imagine at that time. Slashers were dead, too. That's another thing that's impressive. It was slasher movies were dead at the time.
Yeah.
And it was actually released on Christmas. And it opened up, from what I understand, it opened up very quietly.
Yeah.
But the word of mouth spread that it quickly became a cultural phenomenon. And like The Ring after it, it set up a trend of a new type of horror films where after that they were all these postmodern self-aware, meta, ultra-ironic slasher films.
Yeah.
Though, much like The Ring after, I don't think most of the imitations understood what made the original Scream and Scream 2 work so well. A lot of them just sucked, to be quite honest. It started a really bad trend through no fault of its own, because those films are superb.
It amazed me at the time that back-to-back years, 96 and 97, that Scream would make such an impact, and Scream 2 would come out just a year later and make almost the same impact.
Pretty much. It's very slim. The differences in how much money each one made. The first one was only slightly bigger than the second one. I imagine it followed the same trajectory as Get Out and Us, where one opened up slow, Scream, and then just made money through word of mouth, and the follow-up opened up big. Didn't almost reached it, but probably opened up a lot stronger, I imagine. Scream, to have 3 movies in the top 30 highest grossing horror films of all time, shows you what a fucking success that franchise was.
Coming in at number 16, we're going all the way back to 1986, Aliens.
That doesn't surprise me.
It was a little more action-adventure than the first one, but still a solid horror film.
How much did it make? Unadjusted.
Unadjusted in the box office, it made $85,160,000 in 86.
Okay, and adjusted by today's numbers, what would be the equivalent?
$209,801,000.
So a smashing success.
Yes.
I prefer the first one still, but the second one is great.
And number 15, one that wasn't great, but I thought it was pretty good, World War Z from 2013.
I didn't like it.
It made over $200 million, $202,359,000 in the
God
box
knows
office.
why.
Yeah, and adjusted for inflation, even though it was only 2013, adjusted for inflation is $225,591,000.
I went to go see that with a group of friends back in 2013, and I just kept laughing at it. I thought it was stupid, and it made me giggle, and it made me bust up. And I had some of the girls that we were hanging around, they kept looking at me like I was insane, because they were obviously very entertained by it, but they kept looking at me like, what's wrong with you? Why are you laughing at this?
But I enjoyed it, but it's almost 100% on the surface is how much I enjoyed it. You know, I just liked seeing these running zombies just piling on top of each other in these crazy effects.
I think it's kind of generic, and it doesn't have much rewatchability value. And I think part of it was Brad Pitt driving its box office success to have such a big star at the center of a zombie apocalypse film.
Yeah.
David Fincher was going to make a sequel to it, and apparently he's not going through with it at all. I'm glad. I really don't think he should be swimming around in that. Let him do something. David Fincher hardly ever makes movies anymore.
Yeah.
So rarely that if he does make something, do something original, because if you're going to disappear for 6 or 7 years, I don't want to see a sequel from World War Z from you. I want to see you do something original.
Yeah, don't you think that's beneath him? Not just because it's a sequel. It seems to be
beneath his talents.
Yeah.
Well, I am looking forward to Mindhunter Season 2.
Coming up at number 14 is The Great Interview with a Vampire from 1994. It made $150,264,000 in the theater.
At the time?
Yes.
See, that's another one where that gross would be impressive now, unadjusted
Yes,
for that kind of film.
$150 million, wow. And adjusted for inflation, that's a $229,666,000.
So that would have been a big smash. And that's another one where I feel like I love Interview with the Vampire. A lot of it was probably all the box office star power. To have Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt in a movie together was probably a big draw. The quality of it, it's so obviously a Hollywood production, but in the best kind of way. And it's made Anne Rice more of a household name.
And one of the biggest surprises and highest moments of Tom Cruise's career.
One of his very best performances.
And coming up at number 13 is another one of my favorite horror films, Poltergeist from 1982. The legendary teaming of Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg.
Well, with Steven Spielberg attached, who's the biggest box office juggernaut of all time, especially at that time, that one's not too much of a shocker.
And that really holds up on repeat viewings, too.
And how ingrained is that image in our culture? The image of the little girl just touching the TV screen. That image, I feel like, has been used so many times that it's ingrained, or it's seeped into the cultural consciousness, where even if you've never seen that movie, you know what it is, and you know that image.
And everyone knows the quote, "They're here."
Yes.
That's the first thing they think when they see that iconic image.
Yes.
And all the way back in 1982, it made $76,606,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's $238,156,000. Poltergeist would have made today.
Blockbuster numbers. That came out the same year as E.T.
Oh, yeah.
Another Steven Spielberg film, so he was on fire that year.
And coming up after Poltergeist is one that we've talked about quite a bit recently, is the Blair Witch Project from 1999, another big year for horror films.
How much is it unadjusted for inflation? How much did it make in its time?
In its time, it made $140,539,000.
All right, see, that's another one. That's such a low-budget shoestring film that now, if it made that much, came out now, that would already be impressive beyond belief. How much is it adjusted?
A whopping $252,859,000.
I can't even fathom a movie like that becoming a hit in this day and age, such a low budget. But you know what? It's probably because a lot of the very biggest films of all time were big because they were unprecedented.
Yeah.
Whenever you do something that's never been seen before, that's never been done in the mainstream, it's always going to draw more attention than anything that comes after it, that follows it. So I imagine part of it was not just the novelty of what it was, but also the fact that it was advertised as being real. It became such a big sensation, and I think that's when the internet was starting to grow, and internet culture was starting to really foster as something to spread the news, to spread news about things that you were excited about. So that one probably really drove this one all the way over to success.
And they spent a lot more on marketing than they actually spent on the movie. But it's still, even that wasn't that much. It was only $1 million or $2 million that they spent on the marketing, and it just took off to what would now equal $252 million.
Impressive.
Coming in at number 11, I actually forgot to write down the year of this, but it was back in the 70s, The Omen. You recall what year that was?
The Omen, I believe, was around 1975.
It looks like that's the oldest horror film on the list so far.
The Omen? So far.
Yeah.
1976. It came out in 1976. So it was another one that was probably, riding the wave of The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby and all the satanic horror that was such a big thing in the 1970s.
Yeah, and it may not sound too impressive that it only made $60,922,000 in the box office at the time, but adjusted for inflation, that's $261,425,000.
A blockbuster horror film, and an original blockbuster horror film at that.
So they got asses in the seats. Do you think the success of The Omen has something to do with the success of The Exorcist a few years before?
Yeah.
And that, the quality of it carried it, but I'm sure that had something to do with it.
Yeah, I was riding the wave of that craving for another film like that. The satanic films, which were really big and spilled over into the 80s with the Satanic Panic.
And it was iconic in itself. Damien's an iconic horror character, and
It's All For You,
It's All
Damien.
For You, Damien. That's a classic horror scene.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
Top 10 highest grossing horror films of all time, adjusted for inflation.
And I hate to say it, it's my least favorite of the list so far. What Lies Beneath?
Really? Number 10?
Starring Harrison Ford and Michelle Pfeiffer.
That's pretty lame.
It made a whopping $155,464,000 at the box office, mostly because it was just a solid thriller with two popular leads.
Michelle Pfeiffer and Harrison Ford, and because Robert Zemeckis, who was a blockbuster juggernaut for a while with Back to the Future and Forrest Gump, probably, and Who Framed Roger Rabbit was probably riding that wave too.
For me, it was a disappointment considering
the talents
the
involved,
star power, and the director, but
I never found it particularly effective, and it always seemed a little flat to me.
Yeah,
like a bland Hollywood version of a horror thriller.
Exactly. I mean, solid and everything, but somewhat forgettable. And adjusted for inflation, it would have made $263 million.
Wow.
Coming up at number 9 is a much better film, The Silence of the Lambs from 1991.
So this movie was a blockbuster, and it swept the Oscars.
Yeah. And impressive box office numbers was $130,742,000.
For this type of film, that would be impressive now.
And adjusted for inflation, that would be $279,808,000.
I feel like The Silence of the Lambs is the moment where horror achieved a certain respectability in the eyes of the mainstream. Because at the time, it was acknowledged as a horror film and was called a horror film and was a massive hit. and it won the Oscars. And that's amazing to me that a film that's about cannibalism and serial killers and is as dark as it is and it is menacing as it is in certain parts would actually sweep Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, Best Actor, Best Actress to be something that big. It's one of those rare instances where horror achieved respectability in the eyes of a lot of mainstream people.
Yeah, and the birth of another horror icon.
Hannibal Lecter. And it's definitely one of the more sophisticated horror films to make an impact, too. Instantly iconic, and it's still referenced to this day. Hannibal Lecter is probably one of the greatest characters in the history of not horror films, but the history of films, period. That's a legendary performance.
Say the famous line, James.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
So I defy you to order a Chianti without thinking of Hannibal Lecter. Coming up at number 8 is Alien. That's another one from the 70s.
I couldn't be happier because Alien is one of my favorite films of all time in any genre. Science fiction, horror, anything. It's one of the most perfect movies I've ever seen. For me, Alien is flawless from the beginning to the end. There's not a single misplaced frame of film. It perfectly builds tension at a very steady rate. It's beautiful to look at visually. It hits you hard, and it's scary, and it has some very effective jump scares.
Yeah, and 2 horror icons, Ripley and the aliens.
The xenomorph alone, I imagine, seeing that H.R. Geiger design for the first time must have been so out of this world. And even when you stop and look at it now, it looks unlike anything you've ever seen before, any depiction of an alien before that you've ever seen on film.
And at the time, it made $80,931,000 in the box office, and that would translate to $287,472,000 today.
So a blockbuster, an R-rated. Back in the days when high-concept R-rated horror blockbusters were still a thing.
Yeah, and that was kind of hardcore too, and dark. And
from the bursting out of the chest to the first time you see the baby alien bursting out of the chest, it's not a soft horror movie.
Coming up at number 7 is another sequel from all the way back in 1978, Jaws 2. It made a little bit more than Alien.
Why?
$81,766,000, and that would translate to $312,815,000 today.
Well, I think it had to do with the fact that Jaws at the time was one of the biggest films of all time and the highest grossing film up to the point in 1975 when it came out.
Yeah.
I think it was just riding the massive success of Jaws and how big it permeated through culture. Because even though it made more than Alien, does anybody talk about Jaws 2 anymore?
No.
No.
I mean, Jaws was such a massive success that all it needed to be was competent. And it was at least competent. It was a good little shark movie. It's not as good as Jaws.
But the fact that it made more than Alien is a little bit upsetting.
Yeah.
Because I was like, it's not worthy of it.
Another one from the 70s is number 6. It's the Amityville Horror. In the theater, it made $86,432,000. And adjusted for inflation, that would be $314,736,000.
So that was a really big hit.
Yes.
Especially for a film that's just a haunted house picture like that.
Yeah, and based on supposedly a true story and a really solid, really scary book.
Yeah, I find it surprising that was bigger than The Omen.
Yeah.
Really interesting. But then again, you hear the Amityville Horror being referenced all the time, and the image of the windows that look like eyes and a face is another thing that's been ingrained in pop culture.
Yeah, those crescent windows, that's just an iconic image in horror. You see it everywhere. Do you think they'll go back to the Amityville Horror again? Because they revisited in The Conjuring 2.
I imagine if they do, it might be within the Conjuring universe.
That would make sense, huh?
That would make the most sense to me, is if you're going to do that, it would be within the universe of The Conjuring. And even though the Warrens don't play as big a role in that story, you could probably still get cameos from those characters in the film. You could still get Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga to appear in it.
I could see them doing a full movie on their involvement in it, even though they came in after
the fact.
Happened. Yeah, they did explore the little boy picture. The one that the Warrens took in the house where it looks like a little boy peeking out around the corner.
Well, whatever they do, if they do revive it, it can't be any worse than the remake that we got out of it last time.
Listen to this podcast or I'll gut you.
We're
is
the
our
top 5 biggest horror films of all time.
And we start off with a very recent film, is It. Believe it or not, we already have to adjust that for inflation a little bit. So it made $327,481,000, and adjusted that would be $333,688,000, even though it's such a new film.
So $6 million different.
Yeah, that
Just shows you how much ticket prices get jacked up on such a regular basis, because that's a pretty damn new movie.
Yeah.
We actually got to see. Remember, we got to see that as an early screening. It
Yes,
was such
a better version of it.
It was such a crowd pleaser, though, that we kind of knew it was going to be a big hit. And I think since there was never an It film, it's mostly been the Tim Curry miniseries version. I think there was a hunger for such an iconic character to get his own film, and I think it delivered on that promise.
People really wanted to see Pennywise in the theater.
And I know a lot of kids went to see this movie, too. I guarantee you that it would have made a little bit more if you were to count the fact that a lot of kids snuck into... I know for a fact that a bunch of kids snuck in to see this film when they weren't supposed to. So it probably could have made even more with the slower rating, but I'm glad that they didn't compromise because it was still a huge hit.
And have you noticed how fascinated and freaked out kids are by Pennywise? They're scared shitless of him, but they just gravitate towards him. Mm-hmm. Like I've seen kids, like they'll see an image of Pennywise, and it feels like they're compelled to go towards it, and then they cry and cover their face and run away, and then they'll go towards it again. It's just a compulsion.
And it makes sense, too, because the character is a clown, because clowns draw children, but he's also frightening at the same time. So the image of him works the same way on actual children.
Yeah. And even though the original miniseries I don't think was as good,
Tim Curry was great.
Tim Curry was frightening as
and
Pennywise. Do you think It Chapter 2 will reach the level of success that it did?
Based on this list of what we've analyzed, of what I've observed, no. I think it'll make a lot, but not quite as much, because if we look at Get Out to Us, probably make almost as much, but not quite. Scream to Scream 2, almost as much, but not quite. So I think it'll be close to it, but not quite the same, because there's always the original tends to make a little bit more just because it's a little bit fresher, it's a little new. Yeah. Even if there's a lot of demand to it, the sequels to these types of films typically make a little less.
Yeah.
But even a little bit less, that still indicates a massive success on their hands.
And this one did get a lot of hate. Just because it was so massively successful, it ended up getting...
And a lot of it was people who were loyal to the miniseries.
And people calling it a comedy.
No, not at all. Here's another one. Shows you the top 5. A lot of these top 25 are recent films. And it shows you, look, like I said earlier, horror is making a big impact at the box office right now.
Yep. And we transition from talking about the newest horror films to talking about the oldest horror film on our list. Coming out at number 4, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho from 1968.
Hell yes, deservedly so. One of the greatest films ever made. A highlight of Alfred Hitchcock's career.
Yeah.
Arguably his best film. Certainly his most iconic, and easily his most influential and impactful.
Yeah, and I love the whole story about the challenge of getting it made, and how almost obsessed he was with getting it made and making it perfect.
This is another low-budget one, too. For this film, Alfred Hitchcock usually had a crew that he usually did for his movies, and these movies are very, like, Technicolor films with, like, a CinemaScope, and they're, like, beautifully adorned, and they're filmed with these lush colors. This movie, he actually used the television crew and went a lot cheaper from his television show, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and went down to black and white, cut the budget down really low. So how much is it adjusted for inflation?
At the time it made only $32 million, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that was a lot for 1968.
1960, not 19.
Oh, sorry, 1960. Yeah, even farther back. So adjusted for inflation, that would be $384,426,000.
$384 million now. Can you imagine a movie this small scale and this low budget about just a couple of killings? There's not too much violence that goes on it, cracking that much money now.
That's an amazing number right there.
I think it's that other case of it being unprecedented. There were no slasher films at the time, and probably the most shocking thing was the shower stabbing scene in Psycho. up to that point was probably one of the most, if not the most shocking image yet seen in American films. So it's one of those ones that I feel like the controversy probably drove it a lot to success. The fact that there's never been anything unlike it. Anytime you do something that original, that unprecedented, it usually means that your film is going to make a little bit more.
Yeah. And it had disturbing images, and the psychology of it was disturbing too.
It's another one of those films that even if you've never seen it, you probably know the plot, and you certainly know the shower scene with the where everybody, like, you know what Psycho is, even if you've never actually watched the film.
And you've seen that shower scene broken down, right?
Yeah.
It's just fascinating piece of filmmaking.
A great achievement, and still one of the greatest films of all time. Fuck, I'm not even gonna say one of the greatest horror films. One of the greatest films ever made.
Yeah, and as saturated as that scene is in the horror genre, the shower scene, it's still scary when you watch it.
In context, it still works really well.
Yes, it does.
So we're now on our top three, the three biggest horror films of all time.
Yes, and coming in at number 3 is the great M. Night Shyamalan's Sixth Sense.
The sometimes great M. Night Shyamalan. So how much did it make at the time?
$293,506,000.
All right, there's another one. If a movie like that made $293 million now, that would be phenomenal.
Yeah.
So what is it adjusted?
$526,273,000.
That's like superhero movie numbers right there.
Yep.
That's like getting into like Spider-Man and Batman. Like when you start grossing like upwards of $500 million, you're in rarefied blockbuster territory. That's another one. That was only 20 years ago. I'd have a hard time seeing a supernatural thriller or a supernatural horror film make that much now.
Yeah. And I just watched it recently. It still retains all of its excitement when you watch it. And
the twist at the time was such a big deal, too.
And it's so fascinating to watch the craft that goes into the twist, especially knowing, just being so familiar with it, knowing when it's coming, just see how well it was crafted. It's so good that it still almost fools you while you're watching it. You still get the feeling like it's new.
That was another one that became instantly iconic. Like, even when it was still in theaters, it was already being parodied on television and the whole, I see dead people.
Yeah.
I've seen that so many times in so many places, and it was such a big thing when it came out.
That's up there with They're Here as one of the biggest horror quotes.
That's probably an even bigger horror quote because that was an even bigger hit. And that's another one where horror gained some respectability because it was a massive commercial hit. And it was up for a lot of Oscars and even won a couple, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So that's another one, like The Silence of the Lambs. So we're now getting into the top two. And before we get to say the top two, we need to let our audience know that these two films it's highly unlikely that any horror movies are ever going to top these because of how much they would have made adjusted for inflation. And it's hard to imagine a horror film being as successful as our top two. So are you ready to unveil to our audience what the top two biggest theatrical horror films of all time are?
Yes. At number 2 is the great The Exorcist.
William Friedkin's classic and a great contender for the greatest horror film of all time.
It scared the shit out of most people in the world.
It horrified an entire generation. All my parents and my uncles and my aunts have all told me that when they went to see that, they couldn't sleep for weeks. My mom said it, my dad said it, that they had trouble sleeping. They were scared of the commercials. My grandma was trying to run out of the theater. She told me she ran out of the theater to hide in the restroom, but she got even more scared because she could still hear the sounds from the restroom, so she ran back into the theater where people were passing out, fainting. And it's another one where I think it was unprecedented. How much did it make adjusted for inflation?
Okay, and originally in the theater, which was huge at the time, was $232,906,000 in the theater.
For an R-rated hardcore horror film like that, now that would be impressive. So tell our audience how much it would have made today.
And keep in mind, number 3 was around $526 million. The Exorcist, adjusted for inflation, would have made $943,326,000.
That is fucking massive beyond belief. You know what this means? That's almost $1 billion at the American box office alone.
Yeah.
These are not just superhero numbers. Like the last one I talked about, like this is numbers that the Avengers get, that you would get from a film like Titanic or Avatar. I
Yeah.
can't even fathom a hardcore R-rated horror film like this making that much, nearly $1 billion. So take, for example, Avengers Endgame, which made like, I forgot how much it made. In Avatar, they made like over 600 million. Star Wars The Force Awakens made like 700.
Yeah.
It would have made hundreds of millions more than those movies. It could have taken a massive blockbuster like that and tacked on another blockbuster that made 200 million. So if you put the Avengers, like one of the Avengers films like Endgame or the first Avengers, and tack on the grosses of something like Get Out or even Scream, it still wouldn't reach how much money The Exorcist made. To this day, one of the top 10 biggest films of all time. It's number 9 on the list of the 10 biggest films ever made. So it's hard to imagine a horror film like this now becoming not just a blockbuster, but like a blockbuster on an elevated scale like that.
Yeah, and horror is seeing impressive box office numbers in recent years, but this shows that that's not new.
It's not new, but nothing even close to this. Its closest competition after it is about half as much, and it only goes down from there. And Brian, we may name some pretty big horror films that were big hits. This was a hit on a scale that's almost unprecedented.
I hate when people say The Exorcist was really scary for its time. No, it's really fucking scary. If you've seen it for the first time today with you know, the preconceptions stripped, you know, if you hadn't heard so much about this being the scariest film of all time growing up and you watched it for the first time, it'd scare the shit out of you and you wouldn't sleep for weeks.
And you would think it was pretty effective. And you know what? It's better than most horror. Even though we're in the middle of a horror renaissance right now with the more great horror films being produced, it's still better than most of those, most of those too. So I don't think it's aged at all. I think it held up really well. There was never anything this extreme ever shown in a mainstream picture anyway before. Yeah. Nobody had ever seen anything like it, with a little girl stabbing herself with the crucifix in her private parts and screaming blasphemies and obscenities. Must have shocked the hell out of everybody at the time.
Especially being in a slow burn quality movie like that, you got to know the little girl and her mom.
And it's a very compelling drama.
Yeah. Like
a great film, not a great horror film, just a great film, period. One of the great American films of the 1970s and one of the key films of arguably the greatest decade in the history of film. And it's another one where horror achieved mainstream respectability because it was a massive, massive blockbuster. And it was up for a bunch of Oscars as well. It was nominated for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, for a bunch of stuff.
It's amazing that a horror film that visceral would get attention.
That visceral, and that violent, and that obscene would be that big. Number 2 is The Exorcist. We may never see the likes of something like this again.
It's highly unlikely, especially with pirating and stuff that's taken a big chunk out of box office. All right, we're coming in at number 1.
I'm sure our number 1 isn't going to shock a lot of people.
Jaws, another Steven Spielberg.
So, how much did this make at the time?
It made $260 million in the theater.
So how much would it have made now?
So if it would have come out today, Jaws would have made $1,170,640,000.
$1,170,000,000?
Just domestic.
Domestic. You know, that's the type of grosses that people expect out of like the biggest blockbusters that you can imagine worldwide.
Yeah.
Worldwide. This is number 7 actually on the list of the biggest films of all time, adjusted for inflation.
Yeah.
This is another one that was unprecedented before. It also, I feel like this and Star Wars, in a weird way, as different as these movies are, because Star Wars couldn't be further from horror, invented the modern blockbuster. And it's ironic, as much as we've been complaining, movies like this are the reason that other films like The Exorcist or something like that would not be able to make such a dent now. When Jaws came out at the time, a lot of the big budget, like a lot of blockbusters, for example, were like The Godfather or 2001: A Space Odyssey or The Exorcist, films that you couldn't conceive of now becoming blockbusters. After that, after the success of Jaws, it taught studios a lot that high concept B movie material with a big budget would draw a massive amount of people, so it completely changed the industry. And then 2 years later, when Star Wars came out, only solidified it and made it sure that this was the new type of film. But I actually think it's a much better film than Star Wars, to be honest. As a piece of filmmaking, it's more impressive. And it's unfortunate that it kind of killed off the wave of a lot of more intelligent blockbuster films.
Yeah.
But that doesn't take away from the greatness of the film itself. It's effective today. It still holds up. When I saw it recently, I still felt myself jumping and getting scared, and I could feel the tension building and building and building. Still scary to this day, and still one of the great horror films of all time.
Yeah, it's the quality that gives its longevity.
I can't even imagine Steven Spielberg making something this hardcore now, because most of his stuff after has been a lot softer or even more family friendly.
Yeah.
Not saying that Jaws is the most anti-mainstream movie you can think of. It's not. But you see little kids getting killed. You see people being ripped apart. That's not something that you can imagine being that big now. So
Yeah.
even though it inspired a wave of blockbusters that were a little bit, more childish, the original wasn't actually that. That's not what Jaws is. It's just what it inspired.
Yeah, and some people think that it's a debate whether it's a horror film or not.
Oh,
but
fuck
it's really
no.
not. It's really not.
Watch the opening scene.
I mean, it's not a debate. I wasn't saying this.
Oh, yeah. No.
Definitely 100% horror.
From top to bottom, a giant fucking monster coming after you, relentless killing machine. That opening scene where the girl's being dragged into the water is a classic horror scene.
Yeah.
The tension, the suspense, the blood, the fact that you see people getting eaten up on it. It's a horror film through and through.
It's got a lot of blood and gore, and it physically shows the scenes, the attacks.
What's really shocking to me is, even though they don't show it in detail, just showing that kid flop around, and then you see like him being sucked down, and you see blood just spurting up and down. I was like,
Yeah.
that's ballsy to be putting kids in danger on film like that.
Yeah.
And to get away with it and have it not even be that controversial
Yeah.
is impressive.
Yeah.
And of course, that iconic score. Yeah. It's so simple, but if anybody hears that now, especially if they're swimming or if they're in the pool, it means impending danger or something scary, where now it gives people anxiety.
Yeah.
And didn't it set off a mass hysteria too of people who were afraid to go into the water after Jaws?
Yeah,
Like the public.
If it's not horror, then why were people scared to death in millions to go to the beach?
Yeah, from what I understand, it actually hurt the businesses of beaches for a while because
Yeah.
people were so terrified to get in the water. It scared an entire generation away from the beach during summertime.
Yeah.
That shows you how effective of a horror film it was in its time and still to this day.
Yeah.
So, number 1, Jaws.
Well-deserved position.
Well
for sure.
deserved. So, that, folks, was our list that we compiled exhaustively, consulting numbers
Yeah.
to give you the 31 biggest horror films of all time. Just as a side note, there were other films like Young Frankenstein and Scary Movie that we decided to leave off our list because it would alter it a lot, only because those are comedies with horror elements. Those are not horror movies.
Yeah.
They're comedies with horror elements. So for the sake of purity, the list we compiled is of horror films.
Yeah. And we did mention the worldwide gross, that was going to be too hard for some of the older movies to get a world
The numbers on the worldwide grosses.
accurate worldwide gross. So I put together, just for shits and giggles, a couple lists. One is the top 5 domestic unadjusted for inflation. So the top 5 money earners of all time domestic, and then the top 5 worldwide, which you'll see is kind of interesting how different it is from the adjusted inflation list.
Okay, let's hear it.
Coming in at number 5 in a domestic unadjusted is A Quiet Place, 188 million.
Whoa, that jumps up quite a bit.
Yeah. And number 4 is still The Exorcist at 233 million. And 3 is still Jaws at 260 million.
So they get bumped down 2 spots
Yeah.
if you don't adjust. Okay.
And 2 is A Sixth Sense at 293.5 million. And
That only gets bumped down 1 if you adjust it, though.
yeah. And It 2017 is 327 million. So that's the highest earning unadjusted for inflation.
So that jumps
domestically.
up 4 spots if you take that into account.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the top 5 worldwide money earners. Number 5 is Get Out, 255 million worldwide.
All right.
Halloween 2018, 255.5 million worldwide.
See, all stuff within the past few years, which is why we decided to consult adjusting for inflation, because it obviously tips the scales to anything newer.
Yeah, and even though The Conjuring 2 was not on our main list for adjusted for inflation, it has to be mentioned that this really made its money worldwide. Worldwide, it made $320,392,000. It's number 3 in the top worldwide grossing movies.
So in the U.S., The Conjuring was bigger, but on a global scale, The Conjuring 2 was bigger.
Yep, so the Warrens are still capturing the imagination of the world. Coming in at number 2 is The Exorcist. Even though it was all the way back in the early 70s, it made $441 million worldwide.
Wow. So worldwide, it's still massive too.
It's number 2 money earner, even unadjusted for inflation.
That's impressive.
It will never be repeated.
No,
I'm telling you right now.
Never.
And the number 1 worldwide unadjusted for inflation is the same as the domestic. It 2017 made $700 million worldwide, the most money any horror film has ever made.
Unadjusted.
Yeah,
unadjusted. Well deserved. I mean, it. You know what? The new It does have the feel of I don't know how to place it, but it does have the feel of a blockbuster movie. It feels like a movie that would make that much. It doesn't feel like a small scale horror film. It feels like something that would be a massive blockbuster. It has large scale qualities in the way that a lot of superhero movies do.
Yeah, and the It Chapter 2 trailer even more. Remember the big music and stuff in the trailer?
Yeah, I'm sure that's going to be another hit too, and I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up in the top 30.
Yeah, because I'm really impressed with the cast that they got, and I love all the images that I've seen of it so far. I love the trailer, so I'm just more and more excited for it the closer it gets. All right, and that's our show for today, fellows and ladies.
Thanks for tuning in.
Happy horror, everyone. See you next
horror.
week.